Hello everybody, this is Fun Police and I am bringing you another fire and maneuver video. For today, we're going to be taking a look at the US faction, and I'm going to be giving you a guide and also a variety of builds that I've used in Quick Play to good success. Now, it is important to note that we are in patch 1.1 at the time of recording, and it is likely that things will change in the future. However, I think that the fundamentals of these builds will keep them relatively close to something you can use, even if you have to maybe swap a unit out because they're a little more expensive than they are at the time of my recording. Regardless, let's talk about the US faction in a broad sense. I believe that the US faction is best summed up as a calculated aggression. Unlike certain other factions, we are suffering uniquely from low cohesion units. Many of our units only have 3 cohesion in them. And as such, we have to make up our army carefully because we will lose out in prolonged engagements at range and also can lose out to close range melee if we're not careful. We have to be very cautious in how we approach our enemies. However, when done correctly, we can often outnumber and outfight them in many ways. The US faction is one that does pride itself, I believe, in a powerful close range aspect. Many of its infantry units are cheap and have traits that enable them to perform well in melee. They also only have access to light cavalry, and I would argue this is some of the best light cavalry in the game, or at least very close to it. And then they even have a handful of decent artillery options. But the biggest thing is cheap infantry and light cavalry. So let's quickly talk about the various units. So starting out, we have the State Militia. 6 health, 3 cohesion. They also have the breakable trait and cost 85 points. Personally, I think State Militias are largely meant for adding additional bodies into melee, so I personally only would take them with the basic musket, making them only 55 points. For those that don't know, when units are in a melee, each individual unit will deal 1 damage. So if you have 2 units charge into a square, then at the end of each turn you will deal 2 damage. If you only had 1 unit in that square initially, you would only deal 1. So this is where State Militia, I think, best shines. The breakable trait and low cohesion means that they are not viable to really stand up as individual range shooters. So I use them to supplement my forces and add some extra damage for units that are otherwise going to already be charging in. Then we have probably the mainline infantry of the USA, and that is the Volunteers. The Volunteers also have 6 health and 3 cohesion. This is something a lot of our infantry are going to have, and they don't have any negative or positive traits. They only cost $115 in order to acquire, meaning that they're much cheaper than most other standard infantry, although they are weaker. I believe that volunteers are best equipped with ranged rifles. They don't have any traits to really make use of breech loaders, and I think that they're more expensive and just overall not worth it. At only $105 for a volunteer with the rifles, you can really spam these out and still have plenty of money in order to fill out a variety of other units. Then we get onto the Zouaves. The Zouaves are essentially a volunteer squad that has the melee drill added on. Melee drill means that they're better in melee combat, and I treat them essentially as a more expensive version of the volunteer. So for 15 more points, you get the ability to have a unit that is better in melee. If I can afford it, I generally do go for Zouaves. However, I also generally have builds that don't contain them because I prefer to have, because the funds work out in ways that volunteers allow you to get slightly stronger units or have an additional infantry in the ranks. But if you do have the money left over, Zouaves are just generally better than volunteers. And then we get a unit that I think is a standout of the cheaper line units, and that is the Irish Brigade. Also contains 6 health and 3 cohesion. These guys have shock, meaning that they have +2 charge attack. This is a big benefit because it allows the Irish Brigade to deal a ton of damage when charging in, especially if you can lower a unit's cohesion before shooting. As such, I generally prefer to have them equipped with breech loaders, because what this allows you to do is it allows you to potentially shoot and then charge in. This is most effective in something like attack column, where you're able to move, shoot, and then charge. This is a powerful combination, and I think gives the Irish Brigade some real hard-hitting capabilities, because they're going to potentially break weaker enemy units outright. If you're looking for line infantry to shoot at range, volunteers and zouaves are better, but I think that Irish brigades are important because they are cheap shock infantry. And this is a thing that helps define the US as a close range melee specialist, because they can bring in multiple Irish brigades and have cheap units that are very efficient. Then we get on to the skirmish detachment. The skirmish detachment is something that I don't like. They have the skirmishing trait and breakable, but they only have 4 health and 2 cohesion. What this means is essentially if this unit gets shot at by anything, they will retreat. I don't like these guys. Even though they're only 90 or 80 points, I just don't like them. They retreat too quickly. If, for example, I will pay an additional 25 points to have a volunteers, which has more health, better cohesion, and doesn't have breakable on them. I just personally don't see the purpose of the skirmish right now. I think they're quite weak and I don't use them. Then we get US sharpshooters. US sharpshooters are really strong and probably the best range unit within the US faction. They are units that have range drill, so they get +1 damage when shooting. They have skirmishing, so they're immune to attrition. They only have 4 health, but they do have at least 3 cohesion, so they can take a shot and not completely lose their cohesion. However, the biggest thing is that they are the only unit that is able to get access to the ranged breech loaders, which means that they're able to fire twice at range. When you have these guys in closed formation, they're dealing 3 damage per shot twice per turn at range. This is enough to break any unit's cohesion and deal some damage. And against weaker units, you can outright kill them if the sharpshooters can land their shots. They are very, very powerful, and I think are, at least at the moment, the core foundation of many US builds. And often they are the ones that are giving you your ranged combat power. However, it is important to note that they aren't the most durable, and they will lose out to other ranged units, so they have to be used carefully. Then we have access to regular infantry. This is a unit that is more expensive, but does have 4 cohesion. Compared to the volunteers, they also have the efficiency perk, giving them an additional movement order. This is, I would say, the closest thing the US gets to a standard European infantry, and they are quite good in what they do. With efficiency and higher cohesion, they're much better at getting close, changing formation, and then unloading with breech loaders, which can be a powerful combination when combined with then melee infantry who can charge in to capitalize on that effect. I overall like them, although their high cost means that if you do use these, you're going to end up with fewer units overall. And then we get the most expensive infantry, which is the Iron Brigade. This is again, a 4 cohesion unit, so it's a bit more durable than your other infantry. And it has 2 traits, shock and range drill. The Iron Brigade is a very well-rounded unit, and I essentially view it as a much stronger variant of the Irish Brigade. They are able to be much more effective as a line infantry due to range drill, but they're also able to get in close and still capitalize on an efficient charge thanks to shock. I overall like them and generally do try to include one in my build as sort of my elite infantry. If you need something to break the line, the Iron Brigade is generally the best option you're going to have access to. Moving on to cavalry, we have 4 different options, starting off with the volunteer cavalry. These guys have breakable, disorganized, and skirmishing, alongside 4 health and 3 cohesion. They're overall the cheapest of the various light cavalry, and they also do come pre-equipped with basic carbine, so you can give them sapers to make them only about $125 for a light cavalry, which is one of the cheapest in the game. Uh, However, this combination of breakable and disorganized means these guys are only going to be effective at charging generally from behind into already weakened units. Breakable makes them very vulnerable if they don't successfully pull it off. So they are a high risk unit, but if you're looking to fit in a cheap cavalry, this is one to make use of. I personally prefer to take the Lightning Brigade instead. It has the same stat line of 3 cohesion and 4 health, but it only has disorganized and not breakable, meaning that the Lightning Brigade is much more durable and will stick around and stay in place if you need it to in a much more consistent manner. Whereas the Volunteer, if it gets shot at while moving around, it might retreat and not pull off its actions. The Lightning Brigade will do what it is required to. Now, these do come pre-equipped with carbines, the breech-loading carbines, but you can also just give them sabers to save $80 on them, making them around 135 if I'm doing the math correctly. Regardless, they are very efficient, and I personally take them as my main light infantry if I'm tight on funds and I need to take some very light cavalry. You also have regular cavalry, also with breech loading carbines. They have 4 health and 6 cohesion, so much more durable, and they also have the rugged trait. I don't like these at all, honestly. The biggest thing is that they don't have skirmishing and they don't have anything like shock, so your only purpose with them is pretty much to run around with breech loaders and shoot at them. However, because they don't have skirmishing, they can very quickly lose strength and die if you end up getting shot at by the enemy. So I don't like them. I personally don't use them at all. Instead, for a little more money, I take Custer's Brigade. Custer's Brigade is, I would say, among the top light infantry in the entire game. Custer's Brigade is 4 health and 6 cohesion, making them rather bulky for a light cavalry. They also have access to shock, which is the more powerful charges, skirmishing, so they don't suffer from attrition, and they do contain breakable, so they will retreat if they lose all their cohesion. They do come with carbines initially, but in general, I think Custer's Brigade is really, really strong. A decent amount of cohesion and high health alongside shock means that this unit is able to do almost any task you want. If you needed to run around and just shoot with their carbines, skirmishing means that they won't suffer much in that regard and makes them efficient. They can also get into melee and be devastating in combat because of that shock trait. They're very well rounded and I think very powerful. In terms of artillery, it's a pretty standard roster. We have a basic 12-pounder Napoleon, which is your standard lightish artillery with only 3 range. I personally don't like these. They're a little bit too light and will lose out to most other heavy artillery. You also have the 3-inch ordnance rifle. The 3-inch is, I think, the best artillery piece, or one of the best artillery pieces in the USA. The reason being is it's got 4 range and has range drill, meaning it deals 3 damage per shot. This is enough that it more significantly can break enemy units' cohesion, and notably is that with 3 damage, it'll be able to trade against enemy artillery efficiently. Enemy artillery, especially if they don't have like breech loading or range drill themselves, will not be able to damage the 3-inch, but the 3-inch will break the enemy's 2 cohesion on its artillery and deal 1 point of damage, which means that they're able to very efficiently soften up and eventually break enemy artillery if you're in a sort of, I guess, trench warfare style combat where you're relying on artillery to break the line. That's not the most common thing right now, so I personally don't usually take the 3-inch, but if artillery is better or stronger at some point, I think the 3-inch will stand out. Then you have the 12-pounder horse artillery. If you're going to take a light artillery piece, I would opt for the 12-pounder. The additional movement point on it means that it's going to keep up with your infantry better, meaning its range is not as important, and it can also get away from things like enemy cavalry or just move into position faster, and that's a big deal. So I opt for those instead of the 12-pounder Napoleons. You also have a 12-pounder howitzer. It's essentially a Napoleon in that instead of anti-personnel, it instead has indirect fire, so it can fire over like forests and whatnot. I think they're quite specific. If you know you're going onto a map that has, like, say, a hill, and you can put this behind it, could be useful, but otherwise, I personally don't take them. And then you have Gatling guns. Gatling guns are actually quite powerful. A combination of breech loading and anti-personnel means that they do a ton of damage, and if you can get this next to a unit, they'll deal, I believe, 8 damage, which is going to kill practically everything but the toughest of infantry units. So this can be a very powerful unit to take if you're going to face against enemy units. And it is something that I think can fit into builds if you're looking for something like a heavier or like a way to really shred up enemy infantry. With that all said, those are all the units within the Union currently, so let's actually get into builds. So the first build I'm going to show you is, I would say, my standard build. This is the one I opt for the most. And it is a, I think, well-rounded generalist. We have access to a lot of shock in this build. From Custer's Brigade, Iron Brigades, and the double Irish Brigades, you have 4 units that have shock. You also have access to 2 units with range drills, so you do have some range capacity alongside cheap volunteers for lines. And then you even have a militia fit in order to have access to some additional damage. In general, I'll put the militia with one of my Irish brigades. I will use Custer's Brigade to harass. Volunteers will hold flanks or shoot in the line. Sharpshooters I generally put in the middle of my army so they're protected but can still deal damage where needed. Iron Brigades I also generally have close to my center so they can fight where needed. But generally I'm going to try to soften the enemy up with a couple quick shots and then close in with Irish Brigades and the militias in order to land devastating charges. I think it's overall quite balanced, and this fact is my go-to. It's numerous, so you have the ability to take some losses without losing the match. And overall, I think it's quite efficient. We also have a slightly different build if you wanted to lean more so into US sharpshooters and a number style game. This build is going to build itself more on numbers, and we do have some lower quality things in here. However, we do get arguably significantly more number-wise. So this build is one that relies on double sharpshooters in order to really carry itself. You still have a Custer's Brigade in there, although you have to give them sabers in order to make them effective, in order to fit all this cost. But we overall end up with a slightly larger roster. We have 1 additional infantry, so we have a lot of volunteers alongside double Irish, which personally I use the Irish in order to break enemy lines, and you have a lot of volunteers to go alongside them. You also have 2 US sharpshooters, and this is a build that really is going to have to make ample use of sharpshooters in order to win. This is a build that I would generally take if I'm facing something that also has a lot of units within it. Most notably, I would say things like the Ottomans or the Russian Empire, where the sharpshooters can deal a ton of damage and break their weaker units, and then you have a lot of cheap infantry to get into melees with. You can also use this to maybe fight a faction like Prussia. Because you have so many units, you're able to afford to charge into their lines and break them. Although I think there is maybe a slightly better build to do that with. Regardless, This is a, I think, decent also build. It's going to win some fights, although I do think that against certain nations like France and maybe Austria, you're going to lose out because your sharpshooters are not able to match up to their elite infantries, and you'll generally lose that fight. So it's a build that I think is a bit more specific to your nation, but it can be an effective one. However, if we really wanted to not get into melee, we can do a different build, and that is involving some very cheap and powerful units. So this build is essentially creating itself around having a bunch of range drill. We have double Iron Brigade and double Sharpshooter in order to maximize our ranged firepower. We also have 2 Zouaves, a state militia, and 1 light volunteer cavalry in order to round ourselves out decently. This build sacrifices arguably the greatest amount of units, and you're going to have to really rely on range drill in order to be efficient. Your cavalry is definitely quite fragile, and that's probably the biggest downside of this build at the moment, because you only have a single volunteer. They're going to have to play defensive and really make sure they keep the enemy cavalry in check. Otherwise, you might get flanked. You do have Zouaves, so your infantry are more durable in melee to help protect sharpshooters, and the Iron Brigade still can act as shock units, but they are expensive, so messing up with them can be really bad for you. It's a build that is quite effective, and if you're looking to go pound for pound with European factions, this could be the way to do it. Just spitballing, it is also possible to potentially do something like this, where you take a lighter, where you trade out your militia in favor of, where you instead take out your light cavalry. Oop, hold on. This is a bit of a different build, but it essentially, we're taking a lightning cavalry with just sabers and then using that in order to fit in a little bit more infantry power. Our infantry remains roughly the same, but we do have a slightly stronger cavalry. But you're not going to have carbines on them, so they're melee only. This, in fact, might actually be a better build, looking at it. You get the same thing, but you get access to lightning brigades. And you could go a breach loader on one of the Zouaves if you wanted to. So actually, this will be the build I'm going to say you take, looking at it a bit more as I talk about it openly. Then I have one last build for you, and that is going to be a very different style build. This is a build that is focusing itself around a different unit than we haven't used so far, and that is regular infantry. And we're going to build it in a way that allows us to still have decent numbers, but we're going to have high flexibility. And this is a build that is very maneuverable. If you're fighting against something like potentially the Confederates, who also have a lot of efficiency, you could maybe do something like this to keep up with them. This build has double cavalry, 1 Custers, and a lightning brigade. So you do have 2 cavalry units in order to have superior numbers, and they still both have at least 1 carbine on them, so they remain efficient at shooting. You have 2 regular infantry, which are going to be your main lines. They're pretty standard, and efficiency gives them the ability to utilize those breech loaders well. You have a U.S. sharpshooter, which is always kind of a standard, and then we have a combination of the Irish Brigade and a volunteer, who's going to be your main shock component. Generally, you're going to put the Irish Brigade and combine it with the volunteer, and you're going to charge in and hopefully overwhelm and kill the enemy. You could also opt for something like multiple Zouaves if you really wanted to do a different build. You could do something like this. This would give you a better unit once it gets into the melee, but it would only have muskets, so bit of a trade-off. You could even potentially just do 2 Irish brigades with the muskets, which means that this unit is exclusively for charging in, but it is very cheap and lets you sneak it in. So there's a bit, of course, a lot of variety you can do within these builds, but I think most of these builds are quite good and well-rounded. They do have various weaknesses depending on which faction. That first build I again recommend as kind of the generalist build of, I think, giving the core and the best things that the US A is effective at, but every one of these builds I've shown you is, I think, generally worthwhile in quick play. Outside of that, that is everything I have for you today. 4 different builds and an overview of the US faction. Generally, you want to play aggressively with them, but you have to temper it because you can't go in willy-nilly, and your losses still do matter compared to something like the Ottomans. So you have to be careful, but yeah, that is it for today. I want to thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy this content, make sure to like and subscribe, and let me know down in the comments below. Did you find this guide useful? Have you bought the US faction yet? And if you have, what do you think of them? I'm always curious to hear what you guys think. But otherwise, thank you all so much for watching. Keep an eye out for more Fire and Maneuver content, and I will see you all later.